So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Frank Braunschweig. Thank you very much, Ramiro, for introducing me. Also, thank you for having this opportunity for being here. I will talk a little bit about flood modeling, flood risk assessment, and flood mitigation in the relation with Copernicus projects. Of course, these two things are a little bit far away from each other because one is in the ocean and the other is in the inland. But I will try to show you how some way they are connected. So I prepared this presentation. It's divided into four topics. First, a short introduction about the company and the products we develop. Then I will show some examples of flood modeling, some words after about flood risk mitigation, and at the end some conclusions. So Action Models is a small private company located in Mafra, small town north of Lisbon. We are around since 2004, and we, as Hidromat, are also a spin-off company from IST. We, as a company, many of our staff is coming from Ramiro's group, from Maratec, and all the products and services we do are mainly related with MOHID water modeling system, which we have been heard already about today. We have two main products. One is called MOHID Studio, which is used by a lot of users around the world, and we are also developing operational systems in our product called Action Server. We have already included into our main graphical user interface specific tools to download and process data from Copernicus marine services, like you can see here in this image. And as I said, everything we do is related with MOHID water modeling system. You have seen the slide before. This shows a little bit overview of MOHID. On the right, on the left, you have the MOHID land model, which is a watershed model, colored here in yellow. And on the right, you have the MOHID water model for coastal areas and surface water bodies in general. And this figure shows some of the processes you can solve with these models. Where do we use usually Copernicus products? It is to provide boundary condition at the open boundary of the MOHID water model. Where do I will talk about today? It is a little bit of the influence of the water level, the influence of water levels in coastal areas to floods or during floods. So this, you have still a distance between Copernicus and the way I will talk. Okay, that's the topic I will talk. Just to give you an example. So this animation shows a coupled version of our MOHID land and our MOHID water model, which have been connected by a public library called OpenMI. So you can see on the right, these blue areas is a zoom of the Tagus estuary near to a river mouth. So this model is running and calculates levels and flows. And then you can see there's coming a small river, and you see that the water inside the river is reverting the flow when the tide inside the estuary rises. So you can see that there is, of course, an influence in some areas of the water level inside rivers. We have been working recently on a project for Portugal, for the Environment Ministry, to make a flood risk assessment for the entire country. They have identified 22 areas in Portugal, and 12 of them are areas where coastal influence is significant. So you can see on this slide is in orange all the areas. We have modeled them all, and the ones which are marked in blue have influence of the coast. Also in Lisbon, we are here in Lisbon, it's a place where you quite frequently have floods. And floods in Lisbon, you see on the left, on the right, a street with some cars floating around, which is very often getting flooded. And usually this occurs because you have high tide in the coastal area. Because many of our rivers in urban areas end up in some outlets like you see there below. And so if the tide is high, the water cannot flow out, and then you get flooding inside urban areas. So some examples of what we can do with our MOHID land model to model floods. The first example shows an animation of the Tagus River. It's one of the biggest rivers which we have in Portugal. So, and this animation shows the propagation of a 20-year return period of the flood in the last 100 kilometers of the river. You can see, more or less here down is the estuary of the Tagus. So that would be the boundary condition. And then you can see on the right 2 details of some specific areas which we modeled. So then we also did some modeling in Lisbon. This should be here an animation which is actually not working. But when we set up a model for Lisbon, since it is very close to the estuary, one boundary condition we always have to provide is the water level in the estuary. So we did this modeling approach for many different scenarios. And just one example of results we got, looking to one of the main squares in Lisbon, you can see the results for 5 years return period of flooding. So you get all these dark blue areas where you have water levels up to 1 meter. And if you compare this with some pictures which have been taken in an event which occurred in 2008, you can see here one street where you have some cars floating around. It was a place where usually we would have dinner after this type of conferences, but now we changed the place because this is very dangerous. Then if you look to another angle, you can see in front of the theater some flooding still, just like in the model, a little bit less dark blue. And then if you look to another angle, you can see that the model don't predict any flooding as is shown in the picture. So this is not Photoshop, this was done with the model. So now this would be an animation for the same scenario for this 100-year return period, but unfortunately it does not work, but it will get heavily flooded, the downtown of Lisbon. So what can we do for flood risk mitigation, and what does this have to do with the services Copernicus can provide? So this slide shows a little bit the processes which are involved during formation of floods. So we have the natural water cycle. And then in urban areas, we have what I call the artificial water cycle. So these are a lot of processes. Everybody knows this from primary school. I don't have to repeat this here. So what can we do in order to mitigate flood risk? We can perform structural measures. We can do land use changes, and we also can implement early warning systems. These 3 components should always work together in order to mitigate flood risk. One example for structural measures. In Lisbon, they just approved a plan to implement a new tunnel which divides water from the problematic area directly to the estuary. Okay. So you have now here in this place the current situation of Lisbon with the urban drainage system, and this simulation shows over 10 years return period of flooding. So you can see in this area downstream, you get a lot of flooding. What they now tested are very different scenarios to take the water which is generated upstream here away to directly to an estuary through a tunnel which you can see here. And so we make some simulations comparing these 2 situations, and you can see that this new situation will relieve the flooding which occurs in the center of Lisbon. So now they will spend about something like 170 million euros to implement a lot of tunnels like this in Lisbon. Unfortunately, we only get a very, very small percentage for do this work. So, what I was saying, besides the structural measures, you can also, or you should always think about early warning system. And we as a company, we developed one, we call it Action Flood. It is composed of many different components. We have a data acquisition system for real-time data acquisition. We can process meteorological predictions. And then we have operational models running inside the system and can publish all the information to websites, reports, or mobile phones. So just some example. This is forecast from the GFS global model processed inside our system. Then we can downscale these meteorological predictions to regional meteorological models. So we have implemented meteorological model in our company, and it's running since half a year now. And then we always need also boundary conditions in downstream. So we can, of course, one option would be to run an operational model for the coastal area and then use the water levels produced by this model to provide our downstream boundary condition. But this, of course, is very tricky. So I think a good solution would be to feed the database with this type of information. For these systems don't get too complicated. So some conclusions. Many areas which have high flood risks are located in coastal areas. Mid-ocean conditions can increase flood risk, because if the water level rises, the flood risk increases. Early warning systems help to reduce flood risk, because you can take measurements to prevent and remove things. But they need a lot of boundary conditions, and one boundary condition can be at the end of a downstream chain of Copernicus products. But also, Copernicus products will need, as boundary condition, input from land models. So what I think would be nice to have is something like a database where you have both. You have forecasted water levels in coastal areas, which are provided by Copernicus services or by services downstream to Copernicus. And then it would have also river discharges, not only measured, but also produced by numerical models like MOHD. So, thank you very much.